All right, I think, I'm not sure. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa 'allimna ma yanfa'na wa zidna ilma. We'll start. Assalamu alaikum. It's good to be with you all. I'm excited for this size of a group because we can like share. So please, as we go, feel free to share thoughts. And I think a lot of us, this topic touches us in a lot of different ways, even if this is not our field. And so feel free to share whenever you have inspiration, something to share. But we'll start with Surah Al-Fatiha, asking Allah for blessings and openings. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Malik yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. So I was looking for a way to do a presenter mode without you seeing all my notes on the side, and I don't think that's going to happen. So this is just a process. We're together in this. And maybe the notes will spark ideas for everyone else. So the topic today is a big one, and I actually struggled to narrow it down because I feel like there are a lot of different directions this can go. I am not an Islamic law expert. I'm a student of Islamic law, of fiqh. I'm interested in this because I'm a lawyer. I'm interested in the law. I'm also interested in this just because I, like many of you, grew up in America, specifically in like a post 9/11 world, and came of age like in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And if you will remember, if you also are of that age, that this time was filled with a lot of just like the flames of Islamophobia were just further increased by just people, news anchors, like you're a student in your classroom, your teacher, like it came from everywhere. And I remember as like a 7th grader, I learned about the word jihad from a news anchor. And so you can imagine that creates a very defensive understanding of this tradition, right? It's like there's no good way to answer that question when a news anchor asks, or like a reporter on TV asks a Muslim expert, like, do you support jihad? Or some pointed question like that, where there's obviously a lot of assumptions, negative assumptions being made about Islam, about what jihad is, and there's no good way to answer the question. The person answers in a way that is, they're trying to educate on what the word means. They're trying to also show Islam in a positive light. They're trying to also expose the questioner's like ulterior motives. And so ultimately there's just no good way to get the answer. And so I just remember that like, oh, jihad means struggle, but what does that mean? Like, why is it coming up right now? Why is it relevant at all in this question? Like, I had no answers. And so I'm sure like that's like my origin story. Maybe you have your own origin story. Another thing that sparked my interest in this is in 9th grade. My history teacher said something like, oh, like in this Muslim country, you'll never believe it, but there was a trial and they needed a witness, so they called a blind man to be a witness for this trial. And like he's saying that this is a flaw in like Muslim countries and Islamic law, and I was like, there must be more to this if that's true, right? Like maybe he was testifying to something he heard. Like he still can have other senses, but I think we come to this in a very defensive way sometimes, and that taints the way that we understand this subject. It taints the way that we understand a tradition that's very rich and very has a lot, I think, to offer. So the question today will be, how can we learn this from a more empowered perspective that appreciates the tradition, that appreciates like the flexibility that's built into the Islamic legal system, appreciates also the consistency that came from it. It doesn't maybe look like other legal systems, but there was still consistency. And ultimately, how can we move beyond the law for some of our other issues? Because really, excellence might not come from the law. So let's get into it. Bismillah. So there are, this group, we're probably on the same page on some things, but I thought it might be important to go through some definitions. So sorry about the small print. So the biggest, I think, circle in this is Sharia. It's a word we've all heard. And does anyone know what the literal meaning is of that word? Yes. A way, a road, a path. Excellent, yeah. Some say it's like a stream to water, and water is a common image that's used as like the source of life. So yes, it's the path, it's the way, it's the road. It specifically refers to the revealed way of life as revealed in Islamic divine sources, which are, what are the Islamic divine sources? Sorry, say that again? Yes, Quran and Sunnah, awesome. So this would include requirements for things that we would think of as enforceable by a court, like contracts, right? Enforcing a contract. But it would also apply to things that are not enforceable by a court, like wudu and prayer. Like those things you can't go to a judge and be like, so this person didn't pray, right? But in front of God, it is something that we have rulings for and things that we believe will be held accountable for. So that's the biggest picture of, like, this is the will of God, this is the law of God. How do we know what that means for us? So then that's when we get into fiqh. So fiqh, what is the literal meaning of there? It's on the screen. The literal meaning of fiqh. Too far away. Right before that. Yes. It's a deep understanding. So this refers to the knowledge of the practical revealed rulings extracted from detailed evidence as found in juridical opinions by jurists. And this is an application of the Sharia. So we just talked about Sharia as the law of God, the will of God, and then how are we going to apply that? What does that mean for the day-to-day? Like, are we allowed to do something? That's where the ahkam come in of the rulings of, like, is something permitted? Is it better to leave it? Is it better to do it? Things like that. And as you're familiar with, there are different rulings, and different rulings are reached in different schools. In the Sunni tradition, there are 4 recognized schools, although there are many others. And even within the within each madhab, you'll find all kinds of rulings. It's important to remember that this is human derived. So it's based on sacred texts, and there are ongoing debates as well as long established rulings. But it's ultimately human derived, right? It's humans trying their best. It's people often who are very sincere and who dedicate their lives to this cause, but it is ultimately human derived. And then an important term to know is usul al-fiqh. So this refers to, like, the methodology for interpreting text. So for example, you'll have a Quranic verse, and then you'll have, like, a way of doing things. And those that's common in early Muslims. How do we understand those together? Maybe there are 2 ahadith that seem to contradict. What are the methodologies for preferring one over the other? There's a certain word that's used in the Quran. Is this a command, meaning it must be done, it's a requirement, or is this a command, meaning it's, like, recommended to do? So these are methodologies. They will be consistent throughout the madhab, but each madhab will have its own. And this is how we understand the evidences. I think that's all. There's so much more to say, but maybe one more thing to say is that fiqh is usually categorized as things within fiqh are either ibadat or mu'amalat. So ibadah is an act of worship, and these things are what you would think of with, like, prayer and fasting and going for Hajj, right? Those are things that we don't always know the wisdom. We know that there is wisdom, but we don't always know, like we don't know the reason why Maghrib is 3 rak'ahs, right? Versus mu'amalat. Mu'amalat are social dealings, and there are also rulings related to social dealings. But in mu'amalat, we default to allowing things, just so that we can allow social interactions to happen, so that we can allow life to continue. That's not the case with ibadat. In worship, we do things specifically because they were revealed, because there is evidence to do it. And the default is not that we do it anyway. The default is that we look for sources to tell us whether, we pray at this time or whether we fast in this way. Again, with social dealings, that's not the case. The default is you do it unless there is, textual evidence indicating otherwise. So there's, on one hand, revelation. Quran and Sunnah are here. You could argue that other sources of ijma' and qiyas, if you're familiar with them, are also here. Ijma' refers to consensus of all the scholars on an issue, and it's specifically all the scholars, not just like of a region or whatever it is. It's everyone agrees. And then qiyas is analogy. So there's a ruling that exists, but we analogize to a very similar situation to reach another ruling. So all of that is here in Revelation. As believers, we believe that God is above error, that revelation is sacred. So these are things like the Quran we believe is the true word of God. On the other hand, we have human-derived rulings. They sometimes come with rationales. Maybe that's just the person's thinking of why the ruling is that way. Maybe that's not really based on text and evidence. It's just the person trying to think like, oh, I wonder why this would be the rule in inheritance, right? And they will give a rationale. And maybe that rationale is that person's opinion, and it's not like it's not above criticism. So these are part of a living system. They exist, we interact with them, they grow, they change, depending on the context. So a couple more words, just so we're on the same page as we talk about this. Fatwa, we're familiar with fatwas. This is a non-binding legal opinion of someone who's qualified to give that opinion that is sought after by a Muslim for a very particular situation. So a fatwa that's given to me won't apply to someone else because my situation is very different from someone else's situation. And so, yeah, they will take into account someone's circumstances. Maybe there's an exception that will apply to them that wouldn't apply to someone else. And of note is that in a court system where Islamic law is applied, they might use some fatwas in the court decision. In that case, that is binding, because then the court's decision is binding. But the fatwa itself is not binding. And then next is qanun. So this is a word that refers to codified law. So we're familiar with codified law because that's really all we know in our society. There's laws that govern everything in our social dealings. That wasn't the case in pre-modern societies. So when modernization came and Muslims looked to the Islamic law corpus and tried to codify them, you'll see that they thought about different positions within the schools and made them into actual codified laws. And really, the best known example of that, and earliest maybe example of that, is the Majalla, the civil code of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. So that's where like Sharia law became codified into like modern style law in the Islamic nation state. Lastly is urf. So urf refers to customs. These are customs that the community in this region generally approves of. So jurists will consider urf when they come to legal conclusions. They can decide that this is like normally accepted in this community. An example that's often given is like mahr for marriage. In certain communities, there's like an understanding of what's an acceptable amount. So urf is very much considered. And if it doesn't contradict with anything in the primary texts, in the sources, then it's treated as law. But it's not law in itself. Yeah. Sure, yeah.
So
Yeah. I'll try. And if anyone else has thoughts, please chime in. My understanding, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is that there wasn't, that just this is not how societies approach the law. The law was very much like a common law style. We all kind of understand what is morally allowed and what's not. And then when we have a conflict that we need to resolve, we'll go to a judge to come to a resolution. It's not something that, it's not like there's a book of laws and I can just open, like right now you can open the California criminal law and like see what the crimes are and what the elements are for the crime. Like that's not the case that in pre-modern societies. With modernization, partly because they needed consistency and they needed to apply laws to all citizens in their nation state, with modernization came codification of law in all societies, not just Muslim societies. And then Muslims were kind of, it also coincided with colonialization. And so we were like, the Muslim communities were then trying to modernize their societies and thinking, well, we rely on Islamic law for these things, so how can we make them into similar codes of law? So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about it too. Assalamu alaikum, welcome. So the last part of background is objectives of the law. So you might have heard of maqasid al-sharia. That's what this is referring to. And actually, I want to ask if any, so this is basically where scholars looked at the body of Islamic law and asked the question, what are we trying to preserve? What are we trying to defend people from? In all of the rulings that we have, what is always the thing that we come back to, that the law is like, almost like what are the intentions of the law? What is the purpose of the law? What are we trying to preserve? So they came to the conclusion that there are 5 things that in all rulings, it will always come back to one of these 5. And some people add a 6th. So I want to ask if anyone can name all 5 or one of the 5. I would
say 1.
Yes. So justice is for sure a yes. It's an overarching, and we'll see it in one of the quotes that's coming, it's an overarching part of the law, 100%, yes. So there are 5 things, though, that we preserve. Yeah. Sure. Amazing. Was that 5? Yes. Perfect. That's right. So here they are. So all rulings will always come back to one of these 5 or 6. And the only reason, like, so the 6th one is honor. The people who don't include it, it's not that they don't believe honor is required, it's just that they think it's included in the other 5. So religion, life, intellect, lineage, wealth, and honor. And these are familiar to us, like we learn about the Constitution, pursuit of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So it's not exactly the same, but a lot of legal systems have similar principles where we're always trying to preserve like a bigger picture of what are we trying to get from the law. And so you'll see this in rulings, like if we are, should someone be able to defend their property if someone comes armed on their property? And then you look at the answers. When you analyze the rulings, you'll see that they're always trying to protect wealth because that's someone's property, life, because if the person's armed, their life is in danger. So the rulings will always be in pursuit of these 5 or 6 things. And the quote here is from Ibn al-Qayyim, which says that Sharia is based on wisdom and achieving people's welfare in this life and the afterlife. Sharia is all about justice, mercy, wisdom, and good. So he goes on to say that any ruling that replaces these things with the opposite is not from the Sharia, even if it's claimed to be so. And this is a very early quote. So this was seen as like almost an obvious thing that was attempted to be protected in the law. And when we say we're preserving, we're also defending, and those are kind of like the opposite sides of the same coin, because we're protecting that thing and we're also developing and preserving it. allowing it to grow. So that takes us into kind of the heart of what we're going to talk about today. So you're familiar with the idea that there can be different opinions. We see it all the time. Like, you ask a question, it's like, oh, there's no clear answer. There's no like black and white answer on this. There's many different opinions. And so one of the other parts of like my origin story is that there is a little, almost like an Islamophobic undertone in the way that people understand Islamic law, where they say, like, see, all these different opinions means that there is no consistency and that it's just arbitrary. This law is arbitrary. Legal system is arbitrary. And you see that a lot in the early 1900s when the West started to study Islamic law. And so, just to show how deep this is, there are some quotes here. So it's a writer by the name of Richard Schmidt coined this term Qadi justice, spelled with a K, so that's how you know it's Islamophobic. Just kidding. What ultimately this idea is that he writes about is that it's describing like arbitrary, irrational, and individualistic judicial decisions. And it's made its way into a US Supreme Court case in 1949, where the dissenting opinion, the judge who wrote the dissenting opinion, he was trying to say that this is, in fact, the sentence right before this, he says, this is a court of review, not a tribunal unbounded by rules. So he's like, this court is supposed to enforce rules. We do not sit like a qadi under a tree, dispensing justice according to considerations of individual expediency. So clearly there's an idea that Islamic law is arbitrary, is irrational, is kind of like whatever the qadi is just the Arabic word for judge, whatever the qadi's in the mood to rule that day. And this is 1949, so it's not that long ago. Max Weber, also someone who wrote about comparative law, called Islamic law primitive and undeveloped. Anthony Kronman, quoting Max Weber, says that the judge in the Qadi system would preside in a Muslim Sharia court adjudicating on a purely ad hoc sort of way in which cases are decided on an individual basis and in accordance with an indiscriminate mixture of legal, ethical, emotional, and political, and one might add, religious considerations. And then just to show that it hasn't gone away, as recently as the year 2000, there was a Ninth Circuit Court decision where the dissenting judge said that we must decide cases based on the law, not on our subjective views of equities, and then quoted that 1949 case where the quote was that we're not a qadi sitting under a tree just giving out arbitrary decisions. So all of this is included here, obviously not to anger us, but to say that there is like an Orientalist understanding of Islamic law that sometimes we absorb. Even though we're Muslim and we see this as an important part of our tradition, we sometimes maybe feel this way too. And I think that's changing now, because I think there are more scholars and writers who are Muslim who who write about Islamic law from a more authentic position, a less Orientalist one. But it's important to know that this is out there. So, is it really arbitrary? Historical records indicate that there was some consistency. If you look at Ottoman records, which there are a lot of, as well as even before that, you'll find that precedent was important. Precedent means that in order to decide a case, you look at a case that was decided previously that was really similar to it, and you try to stay consistent with the way that the decision was come about, the previous decision was decided. Basic principles that were accepted as common law were also applied, and contracts were respected. You could go to a court and enforce a contract, and there was consistency in that, in the way that contracts were enforced. There was a basic purpose of protecting the weak that you can see if you analyze some of the historical records. And that's supposed to say urf, I think that's a typo. Customs of the region were acknowledged and respected. So how do we achieve consistency even though we have a lot of opinions? One of the main ways this is done is through a process called tarjih. Is anyone familiar with that? So it's essentially weighing and comparing evidence to determine the predominant opinion in the school. So maybe you've heard that, like, well, there's different opinions within the school, but the predominant opinion is XYZ. So that's this process. And the purpose of that is to achieve some consistency, so that the next time a similar case arrives, we can say, well, the predominant opinion is this. And if there's a need for some of the other minority opinions, they exist. They're in the books. But there is a clear predominant opinion that's come by weighing the evidence and seeing which seems like the stronger, better opinion. And of course, qadis did have discretion in these Islamic legal systems pre-modernization, but they had a framework and kind of guardrails on the outside of what they were permitted to decide based on. And then also they also had there within, so we talked about usul al-fiqh before. Istihsan and istishab are preference tools, that there's like specific ways to have preference of one source over another. And so those were also used by qadis. So the point is that yes, there are different opinions, and yes, sometimes there were people's circumstances were taken into account, but there was some consistency. So now we'll go into the flexibility that comes from having different opinions. So before the codification of the law, so we said once the law was codified, then the law just applies to all citizens. But before that, common people had the option of choosing the scholar they wanted to follow. So I got a lot of this from an article that's available on Yaqeen's website by Dr. Tasneem El-Qiq. And she goes through some cases as well as some other cases that we'll go through. So just to give some examples, this is in pre-modern Islamic societies where the court system is based on Islamic law. The qadi is coming to a ruling based on Islamic law. So a married woman whose husband has disappeared comes to the court and says that she wants a divorce, like she wants an official divorce, so that she can get remarried and live her life. And this is, of course, a time when it wasn't easy to find people, it wasn't easy to track people. Someone could travel and then just, maybe they died, like we don't know what happened to them. So the really interesting thing is that there are different opinions about what happens in this case in the different madhabs. And some madhahib require a woman to wait a really long time, basically a lifetime. But the judges from the madhab that comes to that conclusion would actually send these women to a different court of a different madhab so that they could get the decision that was favorable to them and would just allow them to live their lives and move on. You also have married women whose husbands were delayed in travel, and so their money runs out. And now they're going to a court and saying, like, I need money and my husband's not here. And so some schools of law, not based on what these women are saying, but just the conclusions that their schools have come to based on the evidence, based on their methodology, say that some schools of law will say, like, there's nothing that the law can give her. She needs to have, the husband should have had like an agreement in place before he left on what to do if something like this happens, but the court can't enforce anything. Other schools of law will say that actually the woman can take out a loan in her husband's name that he's required to pay back when he gets back, but it'll just allow her to have some money to spend because there's just a delay in travel and he's gone. So again, it's really interesting to what you find in these records is that the judges themselves were sending women to a different court so that they could get the more favorable result. Just this morning in my fiqh class, someone mentioned that, or the instructor mentioned that this is not in a court system. This is like today in just the normal life of a Muslim, people. That in some schools, the guardian in marriage for a woman, like the person who's marrying off the woman, has to be a Muslim. But there is a minority opinion in the Shafi'i school that says that actually it can be a non-Muslim. And so that minority opinion, it's recognized that it's not the dominant opinion. It's not the mu'tamad of the school. It is a minority opinion, but that minority opinion is available and it's been transmitted all these years, and the scholarship has made sure that it survives in books. And it's now used for a lot of convert women whose dads maybe want to be a part of their marriage and want to be the ones to give them away in marriage, whatever the term is. So it's an interesting use of the law. Even though it's not the dominant opinion, we understand that there is a situation where it might be relevant. And then lastly, reasonable doubt in criminal law is also an area where there's a lot of flexibility that comes up. Criminal law is, of course, not the purview of individuals like me and you. Criminal law is the purview of the state. No one else can enforce, punishment on crimes besides the state. But it's just I bring this up because it's an interesting area that shows flexibility in Islam, in Islamic law. And so there's an example in very early history in the Khilafah of Sayyidina Ali, radiallahu anhu, I believe, where it's like the basically, it's a long list. Should we get into it? It's a long story. Okay, we'll get into it. There's a butcher. There's a butcher who is accused of a murder. And the reason for that is that he's found near a murdered body with a weapon, with a knife that has blood on it. And he says, I did it. He confesses to the crime. And so the decision is, like, there's evidence that the crime happened. There is a confession from a person, and there's a weapon. So the decision is that he is sentenced to death. Before they can actually, apply that punishment on him, someone else comes. Another man comes and says, I did it. Don't punish him. And they're like, what's going on? They ask him, and he says, well, I'm a butcher. I had literally just finished slaughtering a cow, and I was still holding the knife with the blood on it. And then he had to relieve himself. He went far away into this dark area, and there's a dead body. And this is his story. I don't know if it's true. There's a dead body, and then the patrol come, and they find him in front of the dead body. And he decides, well, they're never going to believe my story, so I'm just going to admit to doing it. I'm just going to confess. And we see in criminal law today that there are false confessions all the time. So it is possible that this happened. So in this case, because two people are now saying they did it, no one gets the punishment of the death penalty. So that's the idea of reasonable doubt. It has a long history in Islamic law. There's also lenity given, meaning we're lenient on the defendant. So this idea of innocent until proven guilty is very much rooted in Islamic law. So what does all of this mean for us? I think there are two takeaways that I would want us to take from this. One is the question of forum shopping. And so we see that there are different courts that will result in different conclusions, different legal decisions. And at least in law school, I was taught that that's a bad thing. We don't want forum shopping. We want consistency, because then people can predict how this is going to turn out. And they won't be tempted to go to another forum to try to get a better result. The question for us is about fatwa shopping. And that's not a question for me. We can ask Sheikh Jamal that question if you're wondering for yourself. But the positions on this are so the question is, can people really just choose the school they want for the better result? And there's a range of positions on this. On one hand, the idea is that people are allowed to choose freely between madhabs. And if they're choosing the easiest, they're going to have to answer to God for that, but that's between them and God. On the other side of the other extreme is that no, people have to stick to a madhab. They even, not just a madhab, the dominant opinion within the madhab. So they can't even look outside of that dominant opinion. And if it's hard for you, just, have more iman. And then there's a position in the middle where people should follow one school generally, but they can switch for a legitimate need. not to pursue illegitimate desires. Which one is right for you? We'll have to leave that to the experts. We'll ask Sheikh Jamal, inshallah. Oh, sorry. And then there's another takeaway from this, which is that sometimes we look to Muslim majority countries today and their laws on different issues, often family law issues, the way like human rights interacts with the law, and we assume that that is the Islamic position on things. And my takeaway, hopefully, from this is that the law as it exists in a lot of Muslim countries today is not a holistic understanding of Islamic law. It's not a holistic of an understanding of what the body of law that we just talked about. It does not represent the wide variety of opinions that exist, the flexibility that was built into the system, because now it's existing in a system that doesn't account for flexibility. There's no way to go to a different forum to get a different result. And so the system that it was born into, it doesn't exist anymore. So I hope that when we look at these incidents in Muslim majority countries, that we will think a little bit critically about the results that were reached, about maybe how Islamic law is understood, and we can just have maybe an appreciation of how deep this field is, and how the flexibility that it provided is actually maybe a mercy for Muslim people, and it's not a bad thing. So the other thing, this is just like I have big questions on the screen with not necessarily a lot of answers. How do we, I guess, come outside of the legal confines and reach, or at least strive for, excellence? So the first question I have on here is, why is the law important? And the law is important for a lot of reasons. One is that we were created with needs, with fears, with desires, and we can either choose to submit to those, or we can choose to submit to our Creator. The right answer is to choose to submit to our Creator. So when we choose to submit to our Creator, we have to know what His will is. We have to know what the law is, and we look to the ahkam, the rulings, to bring us this servanthood of God. That's like the state we want ourselves to be in. And we want to become the best versions of ourselves through that, through the law. What if, the next question is, what happens when form is not possible? So we know famously that like when you pray, you're supposed to stand. But what if someone can't stand? The idea is that we don't worship the form. We worship through the form. So then from there, the answer becomes very simple. If you can't stand, don't stand, right? You're still worshiping God. Another point about this is that there's a theoretical fiqh, and then there's practical fiqh. So in the theoretical realm, we're going to ask a question like, for example, if someone doesn't have like a faucet to do wudu, can they do wudu from seawater? And then we go through like, I'm not going through this, like a faqih is going through this and saying like, well, like asking the questions like, is seawater pure and purifying? And then they'll come to the conclusion that yes, you should do wudu from the sea. That is very different than the question of someone who has a specific skin condition and they can't get seawater on them. Like it would be harmful to them. In that case, if they don't have faucet water, they don't have like, pure water, should they do wudu from the sea? Like the answer is very different at that point, right? And so that's the practical side of the fiqh and the application of it that I've learned from my teachers, and that I think is sometimes missing from the picture that we have, this Orientalist picture of like this rigid law that is rigid but at the same time arbitrary. And then if we want to live with ihsan, the law should be our guide, not our manual. Maybe we're burdening the law with more than we should be burdening it with. And a famous example of this is from, I remember a scholar sharing this before, where he was asked the question, like, is it haram to celebrate Halloween? And he did his analysis and came to the conclusion that, like, based on what was actually being done to celebrate, these are like children, they're celebrating, he says it's not haram to celebrate. And at the same time, he tells his children, I don't want you to celebrate Halloween. It's not about the law. And sometimes we need to move past the law. For him, he's like, it's like part of a culture that he doesn't like and he doesn't want his kids to get too caught up in. But that has nothing to do with the law, right? Some things are not, it's not always about like what's permitted and what's not permitted. If we're looking for a manual, the fiqh a manual of life to have good interpersonal relationships, to have a good marriage, to have a good contract, to have a good business relationship, we're not going to find that in the fiqh manuals. We're actually going to find that in the example of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's where we look for our, our ideals. Like, what does the ideal situation look like? What does the ideal relationship look like? That's not in the fiqh. That's in the example of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we have so many examples of that and so many ways to glean inspiration. So that is, I think, where I want to leave this. There's so much more to be said and so many more questions to ask. Last time I did not get to share my sources, so I made sure to write down all the articles that I referenced, and of course, like my teachers who have shaped kind of the framework for my understanding of these issues. And I think that's it. If there are any comments, maybe we can take comments, and then otherwise we'll close. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. That was really,
Of course. Alhamdulillah.
I guess the question, because what I took away, especially in the ending of your talk, is that the law kind of exists to enforce, I guess, the bare minimum of what's right, kind of like the basics. And of course, we should all strive to elevate beyond that. But then, what do you do in the context, or what can Islamic law offer us in the context of international law, for example, especially in this day and age where we see that even the most basic bare minimum standards of international legal norms are completely neglected, and Gaza is obviously the graveyard of international law. One can go further and say the same for Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So I guess what would be kind of an offering from a framework of Islamic law that would, I guess, reconcile and correct that?
It's a good question. I think this is not an issue of the law, because the legal framework exists and the laws exist. It's just people who are feeling like they're above the law, people who are feeling like who's going to stop me, you know? And so this is actually an example of where the law doesn't help us. The law, we need to go beyond that and care about people, care about excellence, care about like ihsan, living in a way that where we recognize that we're accountable before God. And these people who are committing atrocities in Gaza and all the places that you mentioned are acting like they're not. I think believe that they're not accountable. I think the law has a lot to offer in terms of framework, especially in there are scholars who have done really interesting work on what can Islamic law frameworks on like reasonable doubt and other areas of criminal law offer American legal systems, which is super fascinating. But I think in the international law context where we see laws just not respected and just truly like as if they don't exist, then the law more laws is not going to help. Beautiful. Yeah.
So then, is there like a framework for enforcing those laws that Islamic law might? Sorry, I know it's not an easy question. I genuinely ask out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For enforcement.
Yeah, exactly. That Islamic law that there might have been, whether it's when the Ottoman Empire codified law, or even before that, is there kind of a framework that one can derive from that? I guess my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know, but I want to think more about this. Yeah, do you have an answer to that?
Just like,
Yeah.